Thank you, Siobhan. Thanks for your introduction, and it gives me great pleasure to be chairing this RSC and RCN Scotland event, which I'm sure is going to be really interesting. It's also particularly poignant and timely given this weekend of all weekends that we commemorate the armistice of 1918, that we remember those who were part of the conflicts of the First World War. We remember not only those who fought, but also those who served. And sometimes history is often just that, it's about his stories. But tonight we're going to hear about her stories. So for us as nurses and as women who were thinking about history, it's important that we remember the women who were part of that. As we'll hear tonight, Dr Diane Atkinson will recall two of these women's stories. But before Diane starts her presentation, and there'll be time for questions afterwards, a little bit about Diane. Diane Atkinson was born in Sunderland and educated in Cornwall and London. She taught history in London to 11 to 12, 18-year-olds students before moving to the Museum of London, where she was a lecturer and a curator. At the Museum of London in 1992, she was responsible for the widely acclaimed Purple, White and Green Suffragettes in London, 1906 to 1914, a major exhibition on the innovative merchandising skills of the militant campaigners for the vote, which travelled to New Zealand and then to Australia. In 1994, she was awarded her PhD on the politics of women's sweated labour by the University of London. In 2004, she completed an MA in life writing from the University of East Anglia. She has a number of publications on suffragettes, votes for women, and in 2009 she published Elsie and Mari Go to War. And that's the publication that we're looking at tonight. Her blog has a fab title. I'd urge you to have a look at it, Die the Dauntless. In 2014, she raised money to commission the Belgian sculptor to make a life-size statue in bronze of Elsie Knocker and Mari Chisholm, the only two women to nurse on the Western Front line during the First World War. It was unveiled at Ypres on the 22nd of November 2014, the centenary of Elsie and Mari's arrival in the village. And Diane has worked in television, film and radio. And we were just talking about the fact that she was also the consultant for the Suffragettes film, if any of you have seen that. Diane's latest book, Rise Up Women, The Remarkable Lives of the Suffragettes, was published in February of this year and brings out of the shadows the unsung heroes of the women's movement of that time. The MP Harriet Harman said of this book, "A thrilling and inspiring read. For too long, these extraordinary women have been hidden from history. Rise Up Women should be a standard text in all schools and will be treasured as a handbook for today's feminists." So on the theme of inspiring women, Diane, will you now tell us the story of two more extraordinary women from the First World War, Elsie Knocker and Mari Chisholm.
Well, thank you so much, Alison, and thank you everybody for coming along on this, what I find to be quite a chilly night in Edinburgh. I always love being asked to talk about these two because they were so extraordinary. They were so special and so appealing. I spent a lot of my time reading their diaries and their correspondence and immersing myself in their lives. And although my book came out quite a few years ago, I often think about them. I think they've left their mark on me, and I wish I had a tenth of the courage that these women had, because they were quite outstanding. I'd like to show you some images of their life and times in Belgium, and just give a sense of the circumstances in which they found themselves, because they lived in the most atrocious conditions. They were remarkable for saving hundreds of men's lives. They had this incredible spirit to stay there until the end of the war, and they were absolutely indomitable. The British Army was always trying to sweep them out of the way, send them back to Blighty, stop getting them and being a nuisance, but they refused to budge. Unfortunately, they had friends in high places who made sure that they were the only women who were allowed to stay that close to the enemy action. So that tells a lot about their character and their personalities. Well, here they are in 1916, And we know it's 1916 because those helmets weren't handed out until 1916. They didn't often actually wear them, I have to say. This is more of a pose. And it's probably from a magazine that went to visit them. And because they were so unique, being so close to the German trenches, they became celebrities quite quickly. And by the Christmas of 1914, January 1915, they were starting to be talked about in the press. And the word was kind of bubbling around the world, even, in American press too, about these two extraordinary British women who were there in Belgium, who were doing very much frontline nursing. And so a lot of people beat a path to their door. People like Marie Curie and her daughter went to meet them. A lot of American celebrities turned up to meet them. They were the women who everybody wanted to meet. A lot of British soldiers would go up from Ypres to meet them and hang out and party hard, actually, and have a great time and bring them food and wine and fun. So they really made their mark because of their, the word got round about the enormous courage and determination of these two women. They didn't wear their helmets very much because, in fact, they were warned by their very good friends, the Germans, who were in the trenches near where they were nursing, that not to wear their helmets. It was better if they just wore a woolly hat or a scarf. They were afraid that the German snipers would shoot them. And that leads us to this extraordinary sentence I've just said, their friends in the German trenches. Elsie and Mari had unusual relations and friendships with the Germans who were nearby. And certainly it was highly irregular. But the Germans were so fond of Elsie and Mari, they called them the Mad English women. And they were so impressed by them. And they would watch them going about their business. They would always warn them about a big bombardment that was due and say, keep your heads down. Elsie could speak a bit of German, so that was helpful. In all sorts of ways, they were very worried about them because they so admired them and didn't want anything to happen to them. So they gave them a very good tip: don't wear those helmets because you're a bit of a sitting target from our rather amazing snipers. And that tells you a lot about them and their character. The British authorities would have taken a very dim view, knowing that the Germans were so fond of them. They would have felt that was utterly compromising. And quite a number of times they did fraternise with the Germans. So that was highly irregular too. So again, that's a clue as to the character of these women and how widely celebrated and admired they were. Well, Mari Chisholm was the younger of the duo. You may notice in the last picture there's a bit of an age difference between them. Elsie Knocker was about 30 when she went to the Western Front, went to Belgium, and Mari was 18, so there's quite an age gap between them. And the reason these two women of different ages went together was because they were great friends before the war. They were biker chicks. They rode around on motorbikes. That's how we'd understand them today. They were two of about 30 or 40 women in the United Kingdom who were riding around on motorcycles. And that alerts us to something about their character, because in those days, very few women were doing it because the motorbikes were very badly designed. They often burst into flames. They often swerved off the road. So it tells us that they were tomboys. They didn't mind getting their hands dirty because you had to be able to fix your bike because there were so few garages around with mechanics. So if you had a motorbike, you had to be able to repair it on the spot if it hadn't burst into flames. So the character of these women, again, is expressed in the fact they were motorbikers. They raced around Brooklands, they did hill rallying and trials, and they met through a shared passion for motorbiking. And Mari Chisholm here used to mess about with her brother's motorbike. She'd strip it down and rebuild it. And that was what she was doing, kicking around in the couple of years after leaving school, kind of wondering what she was going to do next with her life. The war breaks out, and Elsie, who's had an interesting past life, which Mari actually isn't aware of, but we'll come back to that later. Elsie says to her, we must go to London, and we must meet in London and do our bit for this. We must go and help brave little Belgium. And that's how people talked about Belgium in those days, brave little Belgium, or plucky little Belgium. The language is kind of quite schoolgirlish. So Elsie wrote to Mari, who was at home with her mother and father and her brother, and Mari asked her parents, well, she didn't ask them actually, she said, I'm going to London. Her father encouraged her. Her mother said, you're over my dead body, that kind of conversation. And Mari just walked out of the middle of a family row. She took about £10 of her allowance. She took some underwear, clean underwear, a change of underwear, and she drove up to London from Bournemouth, which is where she was living at the time, met up with Elsie, and they worked for an organisation called the Women's Emergency Corps. They were dispatch riders taking messages around London in the early days of the war when there was so many logistical nightmares about mobilisation of troops, mobilisation of resources. So they were just whizzing around London on their motorbikes. They had sidecars each, but they also had motorbikes too. That's how devoted they were to this new hobby. And it's when Mari's driving hell for leather down Pall Mall, she's spotted by a man called Dr Hector Munro. Now, he was an interesting fellow. He was a GP, had an interest in psychiatry. He was a vegetarian. He was a suffragette supporter. He was a feminist. And he was a nudist. So he's a man with very advanced views, a very interesting man. And he wanted to prove that women were as good as men in these tough situations. So he resolved to take 4 women in his flying ambulance corps, as he called it, Dr. Henry's flying ambulance corps. He resolved to take them to Belgium to be part of a field ambulance division, which would drive from a town called Vern, which was not far from where the Germans had occupied. They would drive out to the battlefields and bring casualties back. So Munro's flying ambulance corps was a really mixed group of very interesting people, a couple of clergymen, 4 women, including Elsie and Mari, as it turned out, and bus drivers, taxi drivers, mechanics, just a whole motley crew of men, mostly men and women, to go and do this driving from the battlefields to bring the casualties in to the hospitals and basic facilities in the town of Vern. So that's his mission. He sees Mari going flat out down Pall Mall, and he says to a taxi driver, a cab driver, follow that woman. They finally catch up with her. He gets out of the taxi and he says, you're a very fine motorcyclist. Would you like to join my flying ambulance corps? We're going to Belgium, we're going to bring in the wounded from the battlefields. Would you like to do that? She says, yes, I'd love to do that. Can my friend Elsie come too? So that's how they ended up going to Belgium, and more or less the rest is history. So that was how they ended up actually in Belgium, through Mari being spotted by Hector Munro and going off in the middle of September 1914. And it's a fantastic adventure. When you read their diaries, you think they were going on holiday. You would think that they had no idea really what they were getting themselves into, because how would they until they got there? So they kind of, their diaries are full of going to Selfridges and buying this and doing that and getting a new pair of Wellingtons and getting a raincoat, all that kind of shopping, ready to go on this awfully big adventure. And I think at first they thought of this as an awfully big adventure. They had no idea, had no experience of anything like this, nor had anybody else at that time. So this is the context in which Elsie and Mari found themselves going across the English Channel, arriving in Belgium, and actually walking into the middle of a humanitarian disaster. It's a crisis. They're driving as far as they can towards the Belgian front line, and there are waves and waves of refugees coming towards them. Where men, women and children, farm animals, people just rushing away from the German advance. And then they realise what it is they've actually come to do. But that didn't make any difference, because they were not faint-hearted by any means. Elsie had a bit of a presence in the motorcycling press before the war. I thought you might like to see her in this advertisement in the Motorcycle News. She's on the left-hand side, and she's wearing her bottle green motorcycling leathers that were specially made for her by Dunhill. Now, Dunhill made a lot of sportswear, and they made this special outfit for Elsie because she had quite a reputation of being quite a interesting character in the motorcycling world. And she commissioned some leathers and a long leather coat in bottle green, and this is how she would drive around in the winter, and she took those clothes with her when she went to Belgium. So this is Elsie making a bit of a splash in motorcycling before the First World War. And Dunhill's had had quite an interesting range for the lady motorcyclist. I thought you'd like to see some of these images. If you're a lady motorcyclist, you would perhaps want to be wearing the bijou bonnet, which was in leather, lined with silk and pleated around the face, and it's very becoming, according to Dunhill. Not sure about that. And the harem veil. That's an interesting one, is the harem veil. Practical and becoming new shape, absolutely adjustable to any size hat, arranged so as to keep the hair and hat perfectly free from dust, so that the veil could be dropped over the face when required. Invaluable to the lady in the sidecar. Love that. Ladies' motorcycling overalls, useful to have if you need to kind of get the spanners out and fix your bike if it's broken by the roadside. Full skirt knickers can be put over a short walking skirt. I bet that was helpful. So they arrived in Perivere, and Perivere is just a little farming community, had a railway station. It was just a typical Belgian town. Now they arrived in Perivere by way of Fern. They were in Fern, and it was basically a town crammed with wounded soldiers. They were working under Hector Munro's organisation, and they found it just difficult to actually do what they really want to do, which was to save lives. That was their impulse. I just want to give you an idea of the conditions they were living under, the circumstances when they were in Fern at the beginning of the war. I'll just read a little bit from my book, not too much. Mari witnessed her first death on her first day at Fern, a young man with a serious head injury. It became obvious he did not have long to live, and she sat with him until he died. Then the nurses laid him out, and Mari and Elsie carried his body on a stretcher to the convent. They also helped in the operating theatres, carrying away amputated limbs, returning men to the wards. The days at Fern were shocking and bewildering for Mari. She's only kind of 18 at this point. No one can understand unless one has seen the rows of dead men laid out on a stretcher, the majority wrapped in a winding sheet, but here and there is one uncovered who's been left as he died. The wards in these impromptu ad hoc hospitals, the wards were hellish places. One sees the most hideous sights imaginable, men with their jaws blown off, arms and legs mutilated. When one goes into the room, one is horrified at the suffering, which is ghastly. I could not believe I could have stood there and seen these sights. So that's the context in the early days of their arrival in Belgium. And what Elsie and Mari understand is, in many of the journeys back from the front, with ambulances filled with men, quite a lot of those men really had survivable injuries. But the journey was quite slow, it was quite dangerous. The roads were very cratered, and the journeys were longer than they should have been. So at the end, they were finding that someone had died in the back of ambulances who really could have survived if they'd been attended sooner rather than later. And it's this feeling that these survivable injuries are just not being managed, and men are dying unnecessarily, that impels them to break away from Munro's organisation and to set up their own thing. That's absolutely in the spirit of Elsie and Mari. You know, that they like to run their own show. They want to make their own rules. They want to work as hard as they can. They don't really want to be hanging around waiting for petrol rations, waiting for orders. They just want to roll their sleeves up and get on with it. So they leave the organisation on reasonable terms, and they go out to this little village. And this is what it was like before the war actually broke out. And by the time they arrived there in November, sorry, this is a map, which isn't very interesting, let's go on. By the time they arrived there in November of 1914, there are very few standing buildings. That bit of the Yser front has been pulverised by German bombardments. There are very few houses left standing in that little village. But the benefits of that location are that they could be settled only 100 yards from the German trenches, and that's the thing that meant most to them, because they want to provide what we now know as kind of golden hour treatment, stabilising patients within the first hour, settling them, and looking after them until they can be sent to more specialised treatments. And Elsie and Mari, that was really their focus, that was their modus operandi for their entire period in the First World War. This house is unusable. They're actually going to be living in the basement of this house. It's a very shallow basement. It's only 6 foot high. So they're living in very cramped conditions. And again, not far from the Germans. When the wind was blowing in the right direction, they could hear them talking. And this is where they're setting up their first aid post. Well, their particular devotion was to Belgian soldiers, and very quickly they were retrieving Belgian soldiers, they were looking after Belgian soldiers, and orderlies who were wounded but not well enough to go back to fighting were seconded to work with Elsie and Mari, and they loved working with these two because, well, it was fun and it was hard work and dangerous, but they were such an inspiring duo. So one of their many orderlies here is helping them plant vegetables and grow vegetables, because one of their many other activities was to go out at night in the dark with hot soup, or sometimes hot chocolate. It was Belgium after all. And they would take hot drinks, hot chocolate, to the Belgian soldiers who were on duty. That was what they did in the evenings, again, to raise morale. But apart from looking after soldiers and tending their wounds in the early stages, they were also providing this kind of soup kitchen up to the German trenches. So again, it becomes like almost a cosy domestic arrangement, and I think they worked on this basis to make the whole thing bearable, because what they were seeing, what they were doing, was just so frightful. They tried to make that little first aid post, their little dugout, as homely and as cosy and as normal as they possibly could. So growing vegetables, making soup, making hot chocolate was one way round, apart from providing an important service, but it's trying to normalise their very abnormal circumstances. Well, the British sort of top brass often visited. They weren't happy at what they found there, but they couldn't keep officers and soldiers away from Elsie and Mari. After all, they're the only women on that part of the Western Front. They really were a man magnet for that part of Ypres. And a lot of the time, Elsie and Mari are working in really difficult circumstances, and I'm going to read some extracts in a moment. But whenever they could party, they did party, and they partied quite hard. They would go looting in the bombed-out buildings, and somebody found a piano. They had to find furniture to make the place comfortable and cosy. So basically they were making home from home, and when it was convenient, when there was no fighting, and there was kind of a lull in fighting, it became a place where British officers and Belgian officers would go and take them food, take them basics, and have a good time. And it was an important part of many of those soldiers' lives. Elsie, Mari didn't know this at the time, but Elsie had just left a very bad marriage. She made a very unfortunate marriage. She had quite a small child. He was about 6 when she went to the First World War. She was absolutely, utterly single-minded. She just left him with her parents, her adoptive parents, and set off to Belgium. She'd taken that incredible step, a very brave step and a shocking step at the time, of divorcing her husband. He was bound on a cad and a lot of other things as well, and she'd actually managed to escape from a very bad marriage. She actually told Mari that she was a widow, and a lot of women who managed to divorce their husbands would tell that lie, because society was very judgmental and cruel about divorced women. They regarded them as Jezebels and not safe to be around other people's husbands. So a lot of women who did get divorced would actually relocate and kind of reinvent themselves in another location. This is what Elsie had actually done. This is what she was doing when Mari met her. And when Elsie puts in her diary, I've got a son, and now I need to find a father for my son and a husband for me. So one of her projects was to find a husband and get married. And she puts a lot of energy into this, and her diaries are full of the friendship she has with various Belgian officers and some very interesting characters. And this is Elsie's first boyfriend, and he's on that part of the front, and he had a whole corps of engineers who spent a lot of time just shoring up that building so that nothing happened to them when there's a heavy bombardment. So George Gilson was Elsie's first love, but that didn't last. Well, the astonishing courage and compassion became really what Elsie and Mari were going to be, how they're going to be remembered. King Albert of the Belgians, who was of course displaced by the war, had heard so much about their work that he awarded them a very high medal for civilian courage and bravery in war. He gave them their first medal. And this is them in 1915. They've been awarded the medal in January 1915, and they come back to England on a fundraising trip. They have this photograph taken, and it becomes a really good fundraising tool, because they're not being paid to do this. All the money they need to run the first aid post, to buy coal to keep the place warm, to buy food, to buy bandages, to sort of buy petrol for their motorbikes and for their cars as impromptu ambulances, they have to raise themselves. They spent all their savings and they had to go and fundraise. And the best way to fundraise was to have these photographs printed and circulated, get the press on board. They're very good at actually public relations management, as it turned out. And they'd come back to England when there were lulls in the fighting. There were significant times when there were lulls in the fighting. They'd come back to England and they'd go on fundraising tours. Elsie was very good at this. Mari was a bit shy because she's that bit younger and kind of more reticent person. But they would fill a hall, talk about the work they were doing, what their life was like. And there'd be a collection at the end. People would pledge money and send it to them, and they'd take that, and that's how the whole proposition and project kept working. So they're always having to keep raising money, relying on donations and gifts to be able to carry on doing this kind of work. So they had no formal relations with any of the organisations because they wanted the freedom, they wanted the autonomy. They didn't want to be in the receipt of a salary or receipt of funds because they wanted to be deciding the direction which they wanted to be running their first aid post. So this set them a task which they were more than able to complete. So very famous, and this is how I got to meet these two. I saw this photograph in a book compilation of images of the First World War, and I saw this. It was captioned "The Madonnas of Perivere," and I thought, what does that mean? What are they? Who are these? Before I even thought about nursing the First World War as a subject for my research. So I looked into it. Madonnas, obviously, that's the kind of their saintly aspects. And of course, Perivere. Where's Perivere? What's Perivere? And that's how I launched myself into writing my book and kind of falling head over heels in love with these two, actually, in the end, is through this photograph. So it was powerful and strange. And it took over my life for at least 3 years. Well, the first aid post became very unstable. And early in January 1915, the Belgian soldiers and Elsie's first chap, George Gilson, said, "You can't stay there any longer, it's too dangerous, you're going to be killed in there." So they found another place, a ruin in Perivere, and they built a concrete room within this building. This is just the front of the building, the rest has just been blown off. And it's heavily sandbagged, and you may or may not be able to see a very interesting little character here. Can you see this little character? Can you see a dog there? Can you see the head of a fox terrier? Well, he's very important, this dog. I'm not being sentimental. He's very important because he often wanders into the photographs. He's very much part of the family of these two. He wanders into photographs. He's there all the time. He keeps the rat population at bay because, of course, there's a huge rat population feasting on the corpses of the dead. And he's good at that because he's a terrier. He also is used to take messages to the German trenches, because one of the important things that Elsie and Mari did, one of the many things they did, was when any British airmen were shot down in no man's land, they were very anxious that the family back in Blighty or wherever would know that they'd been killed. They didn't want them to have this lingering hope that their loved ones were still alive. So they would wait for the fighting to calm down. They would put a message in Shot's collar in Elsie's schoolgirl German, and they would send the dog over to the German trenches, and the message would be read saying, "We've seen some of our chaps been downed in no man's land. Can we remove the bodies? Can we remove the dog tags?" And the Germans always let them do that. And again, it's one of these really important but and highly unusual arrangements that they had with the Germans nearby. So Schott is very much an important messenger. And later on in the story, he actually saved their lives. But more of that when we get to that part of the story. So Schott's an important character, and also, of course, really very good for morale. Well, this was Elsie's soon-to-be husband. He's a Belgian baron called Harold de Cercles. And he called it at the first aid post that we've just seen with a message from the Belgian Air Force asking Elsie and Mari about something or other. And she said in her diary, when he walked in, I saw this very handsome man. I admired his crimson jodhpurs hugely, and my fate was sealed. So that's how, and thereafter she doesn't call them jodhpurs, she calls them his crimson joddies. Anyway, this was love, and Elsie and the Baron got married in De Panne, which is a little seaside town on the coast, in the early few weeks of 1916. And Tatler covered this story. Tatler found this a fascinating story, love in the trenches, and they called this a trench wedding when reports come back. And it's a very big occasion. So as well as doing all other things that Elsie and Mari are doing, Elsie's getting married and Mari's being her bridesmaid. There he is. He was an observer. He wasn't a pilot, he was an observer in the Belgian Flying Corps. There's their wedding photograph. And Elsie's wearing a rather fine fur coat. I'm not sure where she got that from. I think it might have been liberated from a bombed out building. I can't imagine she took that hat with her either, actually, to the front. So again, I think these things have been found in buildings. The owners aren't going to be needing them anymore. And this is what she's wearing to her wedding. So it was an extraordinary time. And trench wedding, the article about the Elsie and Mari was called Trench Wedding in Tatler. And there's lots of publicity and lots of quite interesting people go to the wedding. Everybody expected Elsie to go back to London, just to wait for the war to be over and for Harold and her to kind of start their life together. But there was to be none of that. They had a short honeymoon, and he went back to his barracks in Coxyde, which is not far away, and she carried on running the first aid post with Elsie. He would visit from time to time, but it was a highly unusual arrangement, and the British authorities were always plugging that story. Well, she needs to go home and start a house and be a wife to her husband. What on earth is she doing there, looking after strange Belgian soldiers, strange men she doesn't know? This is a very nice photograph of Elsie and Mari going up to the Belgian trenches when it's quiet time in the summer. That you can see they've got their dog Shot with them. That's the name they gave him. This is Elsie and Mari outside a little hut, an associated ancillary building to their first aid post, in the second first aid post. Notice how young they look like schoolgirls. They've had to cut their hair short because there's a problem with head lice. Their bathing arrangements were very minimal. They would have a bath once a month because there's a huge shortage of water on that part of the Yser front. And so life was very, very uncomfortable indeed. It's hard to imagine the conditions in which they lived. That part of the front, the Yser front, was like a swamp. The Belgian engineers had opened the sluice gates to keep the Germans back. So it was everywhere they looked from their first aid post, from high ground in the little village, when they went into Ypres as well, there was a great swamp around them, and it stank, and it was filled with animal corpses and human remains. And the fact they stayed there for weeks after week, month after month, year after year, was a real testament to their determination to persist. I can't think of anybody who would have been able to stick it out like that for so long. Food supplies were very erratic. They really relied on friends sending hampers from England. They were constantly struggling for money to look after soldiers. It was the most difficult circumstances I think it's possible to live under. And of course, the threat of death all the time, and dealing with some really gruesome injuries. This is Elsie and the Baron's delayed honeymoon, and Mari goes with them on their honeymoon. They go back to, quite an unusual arrangement, they go back to England, and they go back to Blighty to fundraise So they drive around in the motorbike. I can't imagine he liked being in the sidecar, by the way. He is a baron after all, and an observer in the Belgian Flying Corps. But that was just how it was with Elsie. You kind of had to do as you were told. And so they made a very handsome trio, raising money, giving talks, the collecting hat going round, and taking that money back to Belgium to keep going. This is like a Hello magazine shot, I think. This is Elsie, who loved to be photographed. She was a real kind of publicity hound. You could never give her too many publicity moments. She kind of revelled in it. And this was one of a number of magazines who sent their photographers and journalists out to meet them and to do long, quite extensive picture stories about them on the Western Front. And again, she's just kind of like leaning against the sandbags as if she's on holiday. Well, the first aid post, wherever they set up, they had two main first aid posts. As I said, soldiers would go and meet them and just spend time with them because they were so famous and they were such fun. And in their visitor's book, if you like, they even kept a visitor's book, these soldiers would often write poems about them, they would propose marriage, they would leave stories, there'd be autographs. And this particular soldier has drawn a picture, a very idealised picture of young Mari Chisholm. And sadly, the man who drew this was killed in 1917 at the Battle of Passchendaele. This drawing is a little bit earlier than that. But you know, they were called the angels of Perivere. They were called the Madonnas of Perivere. They had this kind of aura about them, and people went there wanting to be able to say to their family when they got home, I met those two and spent time with them. This is Mari's version of a Hello magazine shot. This was in the village of Perivere. It makes a nice photograph, and again, that was a publicity photograph used to raise money. This was a man who was, I suppose, really Mari's boyfriend. He's called Lieutenant Jack Peter, and he came from a very interesting family in England, in Essex. They built aeroplanes. His brothers built aeroplanes. None of them could fly, but they built an aeroplane and got in it and somehow made it work. So they were known as the Flying Peters. And he and Mari were really quite like school children. They were very innocent and naive. And the plan was that if they both survived the war, they were going to get married. And he was such a shy sort of gauche kind of schoolboy that he found it difficult to convey his feelings. But he did a really charming thing. He was an ace pilot. He would drop little presents. He would fly over in his plane. He would drop presents on parachutes outside nearby where Elsie and Mari could go and retrieve them. So he sent little bundles of love, little parachutes of love, down near the dugout where Mari was working with Elsie. And that's how their courtship progressed. He would drop jewellery and chocolates, and really, important and serious items of significance. And one day, he dropped a little wooden doll in his own image. He'd carved it out of just a bit of old wood, and he'd painted it, and he'd given it a parachute, and that was him. He dropped himself into Mari's life. And astonishingly, that doll survived the war period, and it was given when Mari died by one of her friends with whom she was living in Argyll to, it's such a spooky story, to a descendant, a nephew of Jack Peter. So that doll went back to the Peter family after all those years through some marvellous set of coincidences. So Jack Peter died in 1917, and Mari's life really was in a very dark place at that time, and she just carried on. But Jack Peter, who really was the love of her life, was killed. He was a test pilot. He was trying out a new plane, which wasn't properly constructed. The wings fell off, and he nosedived into the ground and was killed straight away. So Mari's emotional life was in a complete turmoil at that point. This is a still from a bit of archive film. Moving film we've got a small amount of that, of Elsie and Mari, whizzing about the Western Front in their motorbike and sidecar. Usually it was just one of them, because that was designed so that the front flap came down. You could put a wounded man in that sidecar. And again, it was a specially commissioned motorbike for them. Monies raised by fundraising in Manchester and Glasgow and Edinburgh. A lot of funds were raised for particular objects that they needed to carry out their work. This is what they called their Henley Regatta Day. And going back to what I said earlier is how they just tried to make sense of what they were doing by creating this other reality, pretending they were at home, pretending it was completely normal to be living in these awful conditions and facing such danger on a daily basis. So when there was a lull in the fighting, I have no idea where they found this boat from, because it's quite a long way from the coast. They had this punt, and when some British officers went down to see them, just to hang out for the day, Elsie said, well, let's go punting. Let's pretend we're at regatta, at the Henley Regatta. And they would put the punt on these vast shell craters that filled with water, and they would just punt around in that shell crater in their little punt. And that's how they spend an afternoon, kind of trying to be normal, pretending they're back in England and everything's fine. This is their dugout in 1918. It's January 1918. And within that ruin, they're still living in this concrete box. And the conditions are deteriorating all the time. There's a feeling that they're going to have to leave this place soon. It's very unstable, and they're going to have to find somewhere else. And you can see there's a Red Cross flag flying over the dugout. That's to warn German airmen that there were wounded soldiers in there. But it's miserable. It's grim. It's not. It's a very, very difficult and unhealthy place to live. The Daily Mirror sent a journalist and a cameraman to spend a week with them. This is one of the photographs he took. This is part of their dugout where they are dealing with wounded Belgian soldiers. You can see they've got their gas masks on, because poison gas is a reality. It's a kind of fact of life from 1915 onwards, this part of the front. One of my favourite pictures is this one. It actually belonged to Mari Chisholm, and it's from her photograph album, which now is in the loving hands of the National Library of Scotland. And she just calls it our family, because for Mari, this was her family. Her dear friend Elsie, Gabriel, their orderly, who'd been with them a couple of years, who were very close friends, and shot their dog, and 3 stray cats who went to live with them, Chinky, Dinky and Bogey. And that's labelled, that's captioned on the back, our family, and I think that's really charming. And this is about 1917. While they were kind of with Elsie and Mari, they went with them up to the line to take some photographs. And at the moment, it's an incredible shot. A shell has dropped nearby, and both of the women are crouched down in the aftermath of the blast, the shockwave. That's an astonishing picture, which was on the front page of the Daily Mirror in the summer of 1917, just pointing out how much danger these extraordinary women were facing on a daily basis. One of my favourite photographs of Elsie Knocker is this one, or should I say the Baroness de Cercles, as she was known at this time. There's a serious point to this photograph. Elsie drinking red wine from a bottle. This is about really the shortage of drinking water on the Western Front. Every drop of water they had for bathing, washing patients, and just cooking, basic routines. Every drop of water had to come from England in barrels across the English Channel. So every drop had to count. They couldn't use the local water supplies because the spring ran through a mass grave of German soldiers. So the only safe water for them was to make this, was in barrels on this somewhat perilous journey across the English Channel. So that's why red wine was quite helpful at times like that. There's only a number of ways you can raise morale on the Western Front, and troop entertainers would go around different parts of the Western Front to try and cheer up the men. And concert parties would be held on a regular basis. And they all had their own names. There was a group called the Diamonds. There was an interesting group called the Idiumpties. I have no idea what that means. And this group here were called the Crumps. And they're called Crumps because it's the name of the sound made by a falling shell. The Crumps visited Elsie and Mari's dugout and entertained them in October 1917. And this is what they look like. And they've actually, there were 12 Crumps on that visit. This is a photograph of 6 of them I happened to find at the Imperial War Museum. They're often in Pierrot costumes, but there's one soldier who's looking very fetching in a dress and makeup. And it's astonishing just to see all the names of the Crumps actually in their visitors book. Again, part of this huge cross-section of people who want to go and be with them. Well, in March 1918, there's the German, the spring offensive of 1918. Elsie and Mari get caught up on that very dangerous time. And they are in the most dangerous part of the Western Front at this point. They've managed to hold the Germans back. Tanks can't get through. And really, it was a very brilliant strategy to keep the Germans behind the water because they couldn't get their tanks through. The water was so deep. That was the only way of keeping the Germans at bay at that part of the Western Front. But in March 1918, there was a huge bombardment of arsenic shells which made their way into the dugout of Elsie and Mari. I'd just like to read something from my book about how close they were to being killed. For 2 days, Elsie and Mari were caught in the thick of it. The shelling was so intense you couldn't hear yourself think. Mari remembered, the whole place went up. The whole line was one long roar. It went on non-stop. The women hid in their dugout with their orderlies, the wounded and their pets, and every sense was assaulted by the continuous bombardment. We slept in tiny bunks. You could touch the walls all round, and the passageway where we received the wounded had been entirely blown in with shell fire. There were slanting cuts for air, which we stuffed with our aquascutum coats, so there were shell splinters coming in from all directions. In the early hours of the morning of the 17th of March 1918, Elsie and Mari were nearly killed in a gas attack. Since poison had been used for the first time in April 1915, Elsie and Mari had been equipped with gas masks, but until now they had no need for them. In the days leading up to the 17th, they'd worn their masks as a precaution, but they didn't like wearing them. We were nearly dead with it because you pinched your nose so hard and you breathed through a tube which dribbled down your chest. They'd taken the masks off just before the Germans lobbed a salvo of arsenic gas shells into the broken down passageway, which led straight back into their position. Even though no one was wearing their masks, Elsie and Mari, the doctor, Gabriel the orderly, and the current patient survived, but one of their drivers was killed. The gas made their heads swim. They vomited and coughed and gasped for air. The terrier Shot, who had been so efficient at dealing with the rats and wandered into so many photographs, died. A month later, Elsie, who was frail and almost able to stand, described the scene to a journalist from the Daily Express from her nursing home in Chelsea, which is this photograph here. She told him, "The firing was so heavy that I got out of my bunk and said to Miss Chisholm, 'We'd better dress. There are sure to be wounded.' While dressing, I heard a shell burst outside our dugout, and a moment later I found Gabriel, our soldier orderly, lying on the floor. I rushed up to him to see if he were wounded, and suddenly I felt as if a rope had been fastened round my neck. I could not breathe and was utterly helpless. Miss Chisholm was rolling on the floor. My little dog Shot, who'd been with me for 3 years, came up and looked at me with wondering eyes. He licked my hands and then died. I don't think that ever before I felt I hated the enemy, but ever since my dog was gassed, I've longed to kill a German." So that's the moment when Elsie turned her heart against the Germans. Astonishingly, the pets, the cats survived, Gabriel survived, the patient survived, of course Elsie and Mari survived. But they were wounded and they were sent back to England to recover. Elsie was more badly wounded and she actually didn't ever return to the first aid post. But after a period of convalescence here in London, Mari was very much at a loose end, couldn't wait to get back to what she regarded as home, that terrible place on the Yser front, living in those awful conditions. for her that was home, that's where she wanted to be, and she was frustrated and desperate to be there when the war ended, whenever that was going to happen. So she's kind of kicking her heels a bit. She goes back to the post, she opens it up on her own, she gets a couple of new orderlies to help her. Elsie never goes back there, but Mari does. And Mari is gassed again for the second time. And astonishingly, she survived. This is Elsie towards the end of her life, with a photograph of her son, who, remember, she left him with her parents and drove off to war on a motorbike. Well, that's her son, and sadly, he was killed in the Second World War. He was an airman who was killed, shot down over Holland. And this is Elsie towards the end of her life in the 1960s. And this is Mari towards the end of her life, living in Argyll, and really very much at the heart of a very interesting and important community, very involved with the Red Cross, very active and busy in the Second World War. She had a really interesting post-war life. And it's interesting to think not just about how Elsie and Mari coped with the change. You know, you're really at the height of your powers, at the most extreme part of your life. How are you going to rebuild your life? How are you going to enjoy your life after that? Because these are defining moments, these are defining times. And what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And that's something that both women actually struggled with initially. Because there was no counselling, there was no understanding, there was no support groups. You just had to get on with it. Everybody had to get on with it and start a whole new life. During the war, the First World War, her parents had left England and emigrated to Trinidad, where her father had bought a cocoa plantation. So she had no home in England. Her brother had fought in Palestine in the First World War and been injured, but survived. And really, Mari, in terms, had a very good war. She had been awarded medals by the French and by the Belgians and eventually by the British, who were the last country to award these extraordinary women. So she came back with sort of a chest full of medals, but then what was she going to do for the rest of her life? And that was something that she really had to try a whole range of things before she came to the decision that she was going to come back to Scotland and build a whole new life. And I'm very happy to take questions on that, but I'd just like to gauge your reaction and what you'd like me to discuss next, because there's so much I can say about this. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for keeping to time as well.
Worried about that.
Okay, questions from the floor. Siobhan.
Hi, thank you, Diane. That's great. I'm really curious about their life after the war, because from reading your book, I got the sense that Mari and Elsie...
There's a mic. Hold on, Siobhan.
I'll just speak up. I'm just curious...
Do you want to use this one?
Yeah, I just got the sense that from reading the end of your book that Mari and Elsie didn't remain friends after the war and they parted ways, and I was just wondering, did you have a sense of why that was? It seemed like such a sad ending to such a great friendship.
Yes, I've painted this picture of this incredibly close, important, intense friendship between these two women, which was undoubtedly the case. But when the war was drawing to a close, Mari found out that Elsie had lied to her about her status. And she felt very betrayed by the fact that Elsie had lied about being a widow when in fact she was a divorcee. And so they didn't speak to each other ever again, which is awful. And whenever I give this talk, people always have the same reaction because it is such an awful thought. They went through all of that together. They were such friends and such comrades, and they'd been through so much together. And yet, that was it. And Mari was the one who called an end to that friendship because she felt betrayed by being lied to. And that sounds really harsh because we think, well, so what? She was a divorcee. But in those days, people were very judgmental about divorced women, as I mentioned. And so Elsie and lots of other divorced women had to lie, had to start a new life somewhere else where they wouldn't be known. And she had to say that she was a widow. And lots of divorced women said they were widows. And Mari took it very badly. I think it's not. I mean, it's not really about her youthfulness, her naivety. After all, there's a big age difference. I mean, she'd grown up fast when she was in Belgium with Elsie. She'd learned a lot. She went to war, a schoolgirl really, and she came back a woman. I think she just felt this betrayal that they'd been through so much together, and to think that Elsie had lied to her. She took it very badly indeed. And I think it's a great shame that those two didn't ever contact each other ever again. And that was very much at Mari's insistence, because they should have been friends forever, shouldn't they? Because they were such phenomenal women.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Yes, in the middle, and then Margot. The lady in the white, yeah, Jersey.
How exceptional and unusual was this? Were these two women in this area and in this place? Have you any information about any others going to join them or anything else happening like that?
They were exceptional. I mean, there was a great spirit of volunteerism that took hold of the country. So people rushing off everywhere doing all kinds of volunteering. And the idea that, we could go off and do something like this. We wouldn't get to Dover probably, certainly wouldn't be able to leave Dover and just go and try and help some sort of conflict which the British Army was involved. So it was patriotism, and it was about the desperate need to help. So lots of people were joining various activities, but nobody did what these two were doing. Women got involved in all kinds of nursing activities, again out in the various theatres of war, but nobody was running it quite like these two. I mean, these two are exceptional. There are 4 iconic women of the Great War, and these are 2 of them. The other 2 are Edith Cavell and, of course, Mata Hari. But these 2 were so famous in their day, and then suddenly they fell off the radar, and people forgot about them. They were completely overlooked, and their stories took a long time for their stories to be told. So they were special, and they just went as far as they possibly could. Other people got involved in volunteering too, and taking up nursing and just getting it away as fast as they could, but not quite on this scale and not quite in that location for that kind of period of time.
As you said, they must have seen some pretty horrendous injuries and infections and whatnot over there. Did either of them have any formal nursing or paramedical training before they went, or did they learn on the job?
Good question. Elsie had actually trained as a nurse. She was a children's nurse. But nothing had prepared her for nothing had prepared any trained nurse for what they were seeing with these battlefield casualties. So at least Elsie had done that. Much nursing, but Mari was just her assistant. She just did what Elsie told her to do, and somehow they muddled through, and she picked up all the skills on the job. But it was just very much let's do the best, because it was what they had to work with was so limited. It's iodine and it's cotton wool and precious water that's come from Blighty. So the treatments were very, very in short supply, very few choices. And a lot of the time was spent just holding men's hands until they died. Not even palliative care.
At the back and then here, okay? Yep.
Hi, I was wondering if there was any records of how they dealt, or if they dealt with any men with shellshock.
That's a good question. They came across that, and their idea was a drink of alcohol and a hot water bottle, and just bedding and just looking after men for the night until they could be taken to a military hospital behind the lines. But their intention, their just intuition was that was the best way of dealing with it. And they had one example of a young soldier, a young Belgian soldier, who obviously was showing signs of shell shock, and he shot his officer. The officer hadn't given the sentry. It was a sentry actually, and the officer had come along and not given the password. And the soldier was somewhat unhinged by this and shell-shocked by the whole experience, and actually shot his commanding officer in panic. And the military police arrived to take him away, and Elsie stepped in and said, this boy's ill. He's been wounded earlier in the year. I'm not going to let you take him away because he didn't know what he was doing. He's shell-shocked. So they had that encounter with it, and that was the only way they could actually cope with it. But they undoubtedly saw a lot more than they suggest in their diaries.
There's a lovely excerpt as well about where the military police come back for him, and they say no, he's not ready yet, and they come back again and they say no, he's not ready yet. So they were obviously protecting him until they felt he was ready enough to go, and it was this whole warming up and just keeping him quiet and keeping him peaceful. So they were beginning to realise that, you know, shell shock was something that you had to treat in a particular way and in a different way.
Yeah.
The gentleman at the front. Yeah.
I'm curious about the German relationship. How did the German soldiers know about them and obviously communicated with them when they were clearly on opposite sides? Presumably they didn't play football on Christmas Day or anything.
Well, they got to know them initially through hot chocolate. Because what happened was they went up to the line to take hot chocolate to Belgian soldiers. And of course they have to be absolutely silent because otherwise they could be shot. So they're sort of stumbling around in the dark with their enamel pail of hot chocolate for the sentries. And the Germans heard, the wind was in the right direction, the Germans heard. And they heard them sort of whispering and talking to the Belgian sentries. So then a German soldier calls out in kind of schoolboy English, I guess, what's going on over there? And Elsie says, typical Elsie, we're having a hot chocolate. And he said, have you got any going spare? And she says, yeah, okay then. So they stand around drinking hot chocolate. So, you know, that's what she's like. She's a tremendous rule breaker. And that's how the Germans really got to know what they were dealing with, that she was fearless. And she was just her own person and just going to run that and do that the way she wanted. The Brits would have been furious if they'd known about that. But the German soldiers on that part of the line for much of the war were Bavarians. And of course, the Queen of the Belgians was a Bavarian. So they felt very torn and conflicted by the fact they were fighting a country where their countrywoman was queen. So that helped Elsie and Mari too. But yeah, it was unorthodox, I think we'd have to say.
The lady behind. Gentleman behind, and then, yeah. Gentleman, yeah.
What career path did each pursue following the end of the war?
Elsie, by this time, the end of the war, I'm afraid, is without a husband. Because his family, who were Belgian aristocrats, had been horrified that he had gone off and married a random woman. They had somebody else lined up for him, as is normal in those circumstances. So they were very suspicious about this kind of whirlwind romance and who on earth was she. So they had private detectives find out who she was. And they discovered that she was a divorcee. And they told him. And as they were very high-born Catholic family who had family members in the Vatican, this was the end. And so the marriage was annulled, and Elsie found herself on her own. All her dreams of giving a father to her little boy and having a husband and a nice life after the war fell apart. So she was on her own. Her son was by this time about 13. And she comes back to England with nothing really, a lot of memories. She tries to pick up her life. And she finds it really hard. And basically, for the first few years of her life, she's doing kind of domestic service at a slightly higher level. She's a housekeeper in quite smart houses. And that wasn't really what she wanted to do. But that's the only work she could get. And lots of women are finding that the roles that are possible at the end of the war in the post-war era are somewhat reduced and often of a domestic service nature. So she ends up being housekeepers to quite smart, well-off people, but it's not what she wants to do. Basically, what she wants to do is to save the world, and she wants to be helping people. She's a great she's a great humanitarian aid worker. That's really would have been her next career if such a thing had existed at the time. So she's thrashing around a bit, and she is just struggling to make ends meet. During the Second World War, she has a really important career in the RAF. She joins the RAF, and she starts from the bottom and kind of works her way up. She's an indomitable woman. Her son is killed. He was in Bomber Command, and she was working at Bomber Command headquarters when the news came through. And after the war, she gets involved in all kinds of benevolent work for the Royal Air Force. She was like a social worker, completely untrained, but amazing social worker, going around helping families, helping widows get their entitlements, helping raise money for their children, the children of widows who's lost their husbands in the RAF. So she's a phenomenally powerful and passionate woman in terms of welfare. And she was doing that welfare work really until she was sometimes on a motorbike. She got another motorbike, and she'd be kind of whizzing around going from appointment to appointment on her motorbike. And when she couldn't ride her motorbike anymore, she'd just go on the bus. And there was a bus strike, and she would just hitchhike to her appointments. So that was very much what she was very committed to. And then she died in her 80s. Mari has, again, a difficult life because her parents have left her behind. And she becomes great friends with a lady called May Davison. And she and May become champion bird breeders. They represented Britain in like the bird breeding Olympics, if you like. They won lots of medals. They won gold medals for bird breeding at the Olympics, the bird breeding Olympics. They breed these beautiful runner ducks. And that's their passion, that's their career. And basically they live together, and they have two women who live with them and work with them. And those four women lived together for 60 years and were very, very close friends. They went beyond being servants, these two, Bird and John, as they were called. They were real sort of equals in the family. And they lived very harmoniously together. And that's really, the life in Scotland was the life that was the most important part of Mari's life, coming back to Scotland, living here really for the rest of her life.
We have time for one more question. Andrew? Yes? Yeah.
You mentioned how popular they were with troops in general. Do we have any like diary entries from Scottish soldiers that encountered them, like writing home about it?
A lot of the people who go there are English soldiers and Belgian soldiers. I haven't come across any Scottish links with the in the visitors book. And that's the only record we're going to. I don't know if anybody ever mentioned that. I don't think they've been cross-referenced in archives in that way. But I guess if there were Scottish soldiers nearby, they'd want to go and meet them. Certainly because of Mari, if nothing else. Yeah, I liked it. Well, I'm sure they would have. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you, Diane, for your presentation. I think tonight you've really painted a picture of the kind of conflict that these two women worked under, endured, but also obviously became friends and cared for and worked really heroically. Mari and Elsie's stories need to be told, and obviously have been told by you. But I think as well as that, particularly this weekend, it's important to remember all of those who fought, but also all of those who cared for those who were injured and died during the First World War. My thanks go to Siobhan for the idea for this and also for helping to it. Also for the RSE, for the staff, Marie, Morven and Kirsty, who have really been the driving force behind this as well. Thanks also to RCN Scotland. If you haven't already seen the boards and the pop-up banners that are downstairs in the foyer, then please have a look. One of the banners actually follows, from the RCN Scotland, follows the journey that a soldier takes from the point of battlefield right through to hospital back. And that's actually was done to be in the centenary of this year, so that you could see the journey that a wounded soldier took. And finally, just if you'd like to thank with me, Diane, for her presentation.